The invitation had said black tie optional, and Michael had gone with the gray suit because it was the only one that still fit right in the shoulders. Diane had picked out his tie that morning before the phone rang. Her sister. Something about Emma's fever spiking again. And by the time he backed out of the driveway alone, the house already felt too quiet behind him. "Go," Diane had said, pressing her palm flat against his chest, like she was smoothing a wrinkle that wasn't there. "Your cousin's only getting married once, probably. Take pictures." He'd told her he'd rather stay. He hadn't meant it as much as he wanted to. The reception hall was strung with white lights and the kind of flowers that cost more than his first car, and Michael stood near the bar for a while, nursing a bourbon and nodding at relatives whose names he half remembered. His cousin Paul found him eventually, clapped him on the back, said something about how good it was that family still showed up for family. Michael agreed. He always agreed at these things. Dinner was assigned seating, table 14, and he found his card wedged between two place settings he didn't recognize. He sat. He unfolded his napkin. He was reaching for the water glass when the chair beside him scraped back. "Is this—" a woman's voice, and then it stopped mid-sentence. He looked up. For a second, his mind simply refused the information. It did the thing minds do when something impossible sits down next to you wearing a green dress. It tried to file her under someone else, a resemblance, a trick of the light, and 3 bourbons he hadn't actually finished. Renee. Michael. She said his name carefully, like she was testing whether it still fit in her mouth. 30 years. He did the math without meaning to, the way he always used to. Some stubborn corner of his brain that had never stopped keeping her age updated alongside his own. The way you track a person you've lost, even after you've told yourself you let them go. She would be 52 now. She looked it, and she didn't. Both at once. The same wide mouth, the same restless hands. But silver threaded through the dark hair, and something quieter behind her eyes that hadn't been there at 24. "You're not seriously sitting at table 14, he said, because it was the only sentence available to him. "Apparently I am." A small, disbelieving laugh. "Paul's my second cousin, too. Small world getting smaller." "Small world," he repeated, like the words meant something. She sat. Neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. The kind of silence that isn't empty, that's actually crowded with 30 years of things unsaid, pressing up against the inside of it. Say something normal. Ask about her flight. Ask about the weather. "You look well," he managed instead. "You look surprised." "I am surprised," he almost laughed. "Renee Callahan, at my cousin's wedding." Renee Voss now. Or, she waved a hand, a small dismissive gesture. Was. Divorced 2 years ago. Back to Callahan, actually, if we're being precise. Divorced. The word landed somewhere in his chest he didn't examine too closely. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it, mostly. "Don't be. It needed to end a long time before it did." She reached for her wine, didn't drink it, just held the stem between 2 fingers, turning it slightly. "What about you? Still married to the girl from the hardware store?" "Diane, 22 years. He heard the pride in his own voice and was glad of it. Glad to have something solid to set on the table between them. Couldn't make it tonight. Sick grandbaby duty. Grandbaby. Renee's eyebrows lifted. God, we're that old now. Speak for yourself. That got a real laugh out of her, and something in his chest loosened at the sound of it. Familiar in a way that unsettled him more than it should have. A sound he hadn't heard in 3 decades, that his memory apparently still had filed away, ready to recognize on contact. The first course came. They talked around the edges of things, her job, some marketing firm in Charlotte, his contracting business, the kitchen renovations, the slow grind of running his own crew. Safe things, surface things. But underneath the surface talk, he felt the old current running, the one he used to know the shape of better than he knew his own hands. This is fine. This is just two old friends catching up. Nothing about this is anything. He almost believed it. Then the waiter cleared the plates, and Renee turned to face him fully, the candlelight catching the side of her face, and she asked the question he realized, with a small, sinking certainty. He'd been waiting for all night without admitting it. "Do you ever think about that summer?" The band was tuning up somewhere behind them, a low hum of strings finding their pitch. Michael set down his water glass very carefully, the way a man sets down something that might otherwise shake in his hand. "Which summer?" he said, though he knew exactly which one. "You know which one." Renee's voice had dropped, quieter now, just for him, the noise of the reception falling away around the edges of it. "The one before I left." He didn't answer right away. He thought about Diane's palm against his chest that morning. He thought about the letter he'd written Renee at 24 and never sent. The one still folded somewhere in a shoebox in his garage that he told himself he'd forgotten about. "Sometimes," he said finally. It was the truth, and it cost him something to say it out loud. Renee looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. "Me too," she said. "More than I probably should." The band struck up its first real song, something slow, and somewhere behind them, Paul was pulling his new wife onto the floor, and the whole room seemed to exhale into the music, and Michael sat very still in his chair, aware suddenly of exactly how close Renee's hand was resting to his on the white tablecloth, and of the fact that neither of them had moved it away. The song ended, and another began, and still neither of them moved. It was Renee who finally broke it, pushing back her chair with a small, deliberate scrape. "It's warm in here," she said. "I need air." It wasn't a question, but Michael heard the shape of one inside it anyway. "I'll walk you out." The venue was an old converted barn, string lights strung across a wraparound porch that looked out over a dark field, the reception noise muffled to a low golden hum behind the glass doors. The night air was cool enough to raise gooseflesh on Renee's bare arms. She hugged herself, leaning against the porch railing, looking out at nothing in particular. "I used to think about calling you," she said, without preamble. "For years. I'd get as far as dialing half the number. Why'd you stop?" "Because I didn't know what I'd say. Hi, sorry. My parents decided I couldn't see you anymore. Hope your life turned out fine without me. None of it sounded right." Michael leaned against the railing beside her, close enough to feel the warmth coming off her skin, careful to leave a gap between them that felt, suddenly, very deliberate. "I wrote you a letter," he said. "That August, after you stopped answering." Renee went still. "I never got a letter. I never sent it." He almost laughed at himself, 30 years too late. "Chickened out. Figured if you'd wanted to hear from me, you'd have written back to the last one." "I did write back." Her voice had an edge in it now, something old and raw surfacing. "Twice. My mother must have—" She stopped, shook her head. "It doesn't matter now." It matters. It clearly still matters, to both of us, or we wouldn't be standing out here instead of back in that room. It matters, he said out loud, before he'd decided to. Renee turned to look at him then, really look, and for a moment the 30 years seemed to fold up small and disappear. And he was 24 again, standing in her parents' driveway with his heart going too fast, not yet knowing it was the last time. "I used to blame you," she said quietly, "for not fighting harder, for letting me go so easy." "I didn't let you go easy." The words came out rougher than he intended. I just didn't know how to fight something I couldn't see. Your dad, the letters. I thought you'd changed your mind. What was I supposed to do? Show up at your door? Maybe. A small, sad smile. It's what I wanted back then. Some stupid, dramatic gesture. You never were the dramatic type. No, he agreed. I wasn't. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that comes after two people finally say a true thing to each other after decades of not saying it, and don't quite know what to do with the space it leaves behind. Renee's hand was resting on the railing, close to his. Close enough that when the wind picked up and she shivered, he had the sudden, unbidden thought of putting his jacket over her shoulders. An old reflex, muscle memory from a version of himself that hadn't existed in 30 years. Don't. That's not yours to do anymore. He didn't do it. But he noticed the thought, and he noticed that he'd had to talk himself out of it, and both of those facts sat uneasily in his chest. Diane's a lucky woman, Renee said, watching him carefully. 22 years. That's not nothing. It's not, he agreed. It's everything, actually. Good. She said it like she meant it, and he believed that she did. But there was something else underneath the word, something that didn't quite match. I'm glad you got that. From inside, the band shifted into something older, slower, a song Michael recognized after only 2 notes, a low drop in his stomach following right behind the recognition. Sam Cooke. He'd played it for her once, off a mixtape he'd made junior year, the two of them sitting on the hood of his car outside her house past curfew, not touching, just listening, terrified of how much they wanted to. Renee heard it too. He watched it land on her face. They're playing our song, she said, and tried to make it sound like a joke. It didn't quite land as one. Coincidence, he said. Is it? Neither of them moved toward the door. The music drifted out through the glass, and the field stretched dark and quiet in front of them, and Michael stood very still, aware of the exact half-inch of space between his hand and hers on the railing, aware that closing it would take almost nothing at all, a small shift of weight, nothing more, and aware, too, that he hadn't yet found a reason good enough to stop himself from wanting to. Dance with me. Renee said it before he could think better of it, and before he could think better of it either. He'd already said yes. They went back inside just long enough to reach the edge of the floor, and then his hand found the small of her back, and hers settled against his shoulder like it remembered exactly where it belonged. And for the length of one song, the 30 years simply weren't there. This is one dance. People dance with old friends at weddings. This means nothing. He kept telling himself that, and some part of him even believed it, right up until the song shifted into something slower and she moved half a step closer, and he didn't move away, and the space between their bodies closed to almost nothing at all. Neither of them spoke. There didn't seem to be anything left to say that wouldn't be dangerous to say out loud. Her hand tightened slightly against his shoulder. His hand, at her back, pressed just a fraction firmer than a dance required. The song ended. Neither of them stepped back right away. Walk with me, Renee said quietly. Just for a minute. Away from all this. Say no. Say you should get back to your table. Say anything. Okay, he said instead. The venue's garden sat behind the barn, unlit except for the spill of light from the reception windows and a scatter of stars overhead. Gravel crunched under their shoes. Neither of them said much. Small comments about the flowers, the cold, nothing that mattered. The kind of talk people make when the real conversation is happening somewhere underneath the words. They stopped near an old stone bench at the garden's edge, far enough from the barn that the music had faded to a soft pulse behind them, close enough that the golden light still reached them at a distance, catching the side of Renee's face. "Michael!" She said his name differently than she had at dinner, quieter, like it cost her something. "Yeah, I need to say something, and I need you to just let me say it without making it easier for either of us." She wrapped her arms around herself, though the night wasn't that cold. "I never stopped wondering what would have happened if your letter had come, if mine had reached you. I've built a whole life without you, and it was a fine life, and I still wonder." His chest was tight. "Tell her that's not fair to ask. Tell her Diane is at home right now, waiting for a call to say goodnight." "I wonder too," he said instead, quieter than he meant to. Renee looked up at him, and the distance between them, which had been shrinking all night without either of them naming it, closed the rest of the way. Not suddenly, but slowly, the way water finds its level. Her hand came up, hesitated in the air between them, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her palm before it touched his jaw. "This is the last second where you can still stop this." He didn't stop it. The kiss was brief, a breath, a held moment, the particular ache of something 30 years overdue, meeting the ground at last. And then it was over, and the night air rushed back in around them, cold and enormous. Michael stepped back first. His heart was going hard against his ribs, and underneath the thrill of it, underneath 30 years of wondering finally answered, a sick, sinking weight was already settling into his stomach. Diane's face, her hand flat against his chest that morning, the ordinary, unremarkable trust of 22 years. Renee was watching him, very still, her fingers pressed lightly to her own lips, like she was as surprised as he was. "Michael, I have to—" He didn't finish the sentence. He wasn't sure what came after it. Go home. Fix this. Pretend it hadn't happened. None of the endings sounded like something he could actually do. Behind them, faint and distant, the band was still playing, and somewhere beyond the garden hedge, his phone was sitting in his jacket pocket, dark and silent, Diane's last text still glowing unread on the screen. Emma's fever broke. Come home whenever. Love you. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The garden held its breath around them. The distant band, the crickets, the cold press of night air against his skin where her hand had been. Say something, Renee said finally. I don't know what to say. It was the truest sentence he'd spoken all night. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself, and for the first time since he'd sat down at table 14, she looked uncertain. Not the composed, steady woman who'd asked if he ever thought about that summer, but someone standing at the edge of something she hadn't fully decided to fall into either. I shouldn't have done that, she said. I don't want to be the thing that wrecks your marriage, Michael. That's not who I am. Then why does some part of you wish she'd say the opposite? He hated the thought the second he had it. He pushed it down. It wasn't just you, he said instead. I didn't stop it. No, she agreed quietly. You didn't. They stood there, the space between them charged and unresolved, the kiss already receding into something that felt both impossible to take back and impossible to build anything real on top of. Michael thought of Diane's unread text glowing in his pocket. He thought of 22 years, of Emma's fever, of the ordinary Tuesday night version of his life that had no room in it for whatever this was. Walk away. Go back inside. Say your goodbyes to Paul. Drive home. And let this be a strange, sad, one-time thing that happened at a wedding. I should go, he said. I know. Renee didn't move to stop him. But then, as he turned toward the path back to the barn, she said his name once more. Michael. He turned back. I'm at the Marriott on 5th through Sunday, she said, and her voice had steadied again, careful now, deliberate. If you want to talk, Really talk. Not anything else. Just talk. He knew, even as she said it, that it wasn't really an offer to just talk. He knew it the way he'd known 30 years ago, standing in her driveway, that some doors don't open halfway. Say no. Say goodnight. Say this ends here. Okay, he heard himself say. Maybe. She held out her phone, unlocked, a blank contact screen waiting. He typed his number into it with fingers that didn't feel entirely like his own, watched her do the same into his, and the small, ordinary exchange felt enormous. A line crossed that had nothing to do with the kiss at all, and everything to do with what came after it. Good night, Michael. Good night. He didn't look back at the garden as he walked to his car. He didn't go back inside to say goodbye to Paul. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before starting the engine, his phone heavy in his jacket pocket, Renee's name now saved there under a contact photo that used to belong to no one. The drive home was quiet except for the radio, which he didn't remember turning on. Fields went by dark on either side of the road, the same fields he'd driven past 1,000 times coming home from 1,000 ordinary nights. Nothing about the road had changed. Everything about the man driving it had. His porch light was on when he pulled into the driveway, warm and yellow against the dark, exactly the way it always was, exactly the way it had been every night for 22 years. He sat in the car for a moment, looking at it, his chest tight with something that wasn't quite regret yet, and wasn't quite anything else either, a feeling with no name, hovering in the space between what he'd done and what he hadn't yet decided to do about it. Diane's silhouette moved past the kitchen window. He watched her for a second before he found the will to open the car door. And when he did, the guilt arrived all at once, sudden and total, like a held breath finally released. Because whatever this was, whatever he told himself it might still turn out to be, he already knew, standing in his own driveway under his own porch light, that he had crossed a line he wasn't going to be able to walk back from cleanly. He went inside. Diane looked up from the couch and smiled at him, tired and unguarded, and asked how the wedding was. Good, he said. Long day. He kissed her on the forehead, the way he did most nights, and felt, for the first time in 22 years, like a stranger doing an impression of her husband. The first few days were the hardest, though not for the reasons he expected. He thought the guilt would come loud, a siren in his chest every time he looked at Diane. Instead, it came quiet, insidious, folded into the ordinary rhythms of his life. Breakfast, the job site, Diane asking if he'd grab milk on his way home. Every normal moment now had a second, silent one running underneath it. And in that second moment, he was standing in a dark garden with someone else's hand on his jaw. He didn't call Renee. He told himself that mattered. He also didn't delete her number, and he told himself that didn't. Wednesday, his phone buzzed at the job site, and his stomach dropped before he'd even looked at the screen. It was Diane. Can you get Emma from daycare? I'm stuck at the dentist. And the relief he felt was so total, so disproportionate to the mundane request, that he had to set the phone down on the tailgate and just breathe for a second, hands braced on the warm metal. His foreman, Carl, glanced over. You good? Fine, Michael said. Long week. That night, after Diane fell asleep, he lay awake staring at the ceiling fan, turning slow circles above him, and let himself think, really think, for the first time since the wedding, about what he actually wanted. Not the version of the question wrapped in guilt, or the version wrapped in 30-year-old longing. The plain question, do you want her, or do you want the 24-year-old who never got to finish something? He didn't have an answer. That scared him more than any answer would have. Friday. The text came. heading back to Charlotte. Sunday morning. I meant what I said. I'm not trying to be the reason your marriage ends, but I don't think I can leave without seeing you once more, either. Your call. He read it 4 times standing in the garage, the shoebox with his old, unsent letter sitting 2 feet away on a shelf he hadn't opened in years. He knew exactly where it was, had known the whole week, though he'd told himself he hadn't thought about it. This is the moment. Whatever you do next, you won't be able to say later that you didn't choose it. He drove to the Marriott on 5th Saturday afternoon, telling Diane he had a supply run for the Hendersons' kitchen job. He wasn't proud of the lie. He noticed distantly that it came easier than he expected it to. Renee opened the door in jeans and a soft gray sweater. None of the wedding's polish left. Just her. And something about the plainness of it, the ordinariness, made the whole thing feel more real and more dangerous than the charged garden ever had. They talked for a long time, sitting across from each other at the small round table by the window. And for a while it really was just talk. Her divorce, his business, the strange gravity of growing older and realizing how much of your life had already been decided by people who weren't you. But underneath the talk, the same current ran that had run at table 14, and eventually the talk thinned out, and the silence that replaced it was the kind neither of them tried to fill. He didn't drive home until after dark. He wouldn't let himself examine, later, exactly what had happened in that room. Some part of him needed it to stay a blur, a thing that had happened to him rather than a thing he'd done. But he knew, driving home with the windows down and the cold air doing nothing to clear his head, that whatever line he'd crossed in the garden had been a suggestion compared to the one he'd just walked straight through. Diane was still up when he got home, reading on the couch, Emma's crayon drawings spread across the coffee table from her visit that afternoon. She looked up and smiled, the same tired, unguarded smile she always gave him, and asked how the Hendersons' kitchen was coming along. He opened his mouth to answer, and found, for one long, terrible second, that he couldn't remember how to lie to her and how to tell her the truth at the same time, and both of them were sitting right there on his tongue, fighting for the same breath. "It's coming along," he said finally, and sat down beside her, and let her lean her head against his shoulder the way she had for 22 years, and felt the whole architecture of his life groaning quietly under a weight it was never built to carry. He knew, sitting there, that this couldn't go on being nothing. Something was going to break. He just didn't yet know if it would be the secret, or the marriage, or him. It was Emma who broke it, in the end, though she never knew she had. Diane picked their granddaughter up from Michael's phone Sunday evening. A video someone had sent from the wedding, Paul's wife posting clips from the reception to the family group chat. And there, for 3 unmistakable seconds, in the background of a dance floor video, was Michael and Renee, swaying close together, her hand resting against his chest in a way that had nothing casual about it. Diane didn't say anything when she saw it. She scrolled past it, set the phone face down on the kitchen counter, and went quiet in a way Michael didn't understand until later that night, when she asked him, without looking up from the sink, who the woman in the green dress was. He could have lied. He thought about it, actually stood there in his own kitchen, and weighed it, the way he'd weighed everything else these last 2 weeks, and found, finally, that he didn't have it in him anymore. Not because he was brave, because he was tired, and because some part of him had been waiting to be caught since the moment the kiss happened, as if getting caught might be the only way out of the thing he hadn't been able to end himself. "Renee," he said, "someone I knew a long time ago." The conversation that followed was the hardest of his marriage. Longer, harder, and far more honest than he expected once it started. He told her all of it. The letter, the dance, the garden, the hotel. He watched something in Diane's face close, and then, slower, painfully, come back open again. Not forgiving exactly, but willing to stay in the room. 22 years, she said at one point, her voice flat with a kind of exhaustion he'd never heard from her before. And you couldn't tell me you were struggling with something before it got to a hotel room? He didn't have an answer that didn't sound like an excuse. He said so. There was no clean resolution that night or the next. Diane didn't leave, and she also didn't pretend nothing had happened. She asked him to sleep in the guest room for a while, asked for time she didn't put a limit on, and he gave it to her without complaint, because he understood, finally and completely, that he'd forfeited the right to rush her through anything. Renee texted once more, a few days later. I heard you told her. I'm sorry it came out that way. I hope you two find your way through it. And Michael read it standing in his garage, next to the shelf where the old shoebox still sat. And for the first time in 30 years, he opened it. The letter was still there. The ink faded, but legible. 24-year-old handwriting, apologizing for things a 54-year-old man now understood completely differently. He didn't write back to Renee. He put the shoebox in the trash instead, and stood there a long moment after it landed, feeling less like he'd closed a door than like he'd finally admitted it had been open his whole life, letting a draft in he'd never quite named. The months that followed were slow and unglamorous. Counseling sessions neither of them had ever imagined needing. Careful conversations at the kitchen table. Diane's trust returning in small increments that had to be earned one ordinary day at a time, rather than won back in a single grand gesture. There was no music swelling, no clean redemption. Just the daily, unremarkable work of two people deciding, again and again, whether the life they'd built was still worth choosing. It was, Michael came to understand, but not in the way he'd once assumed, back when he thought loving someone was a feeling you either had or didn't. He learned, finally, at 54, that it was a choice you kept making, deliberately, on the ordinary days when no one was watching and nothing was asking to be forgiven. And that the version of himself who'd wondered, for 30 years, what might have been, had never once considered what it would actually cost to find out. He still thought of Renee sometimes. He suspected he always would. But the wondering had a different shape now. Quieter, sadder, and finally, mercifully settled.